You know, there's a saying, Managing Director, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the elephant in the living room. And I've had somewhat of that feeling in the last few days, that we all know what the big issue is at the moment. We all know the biggest risk that we are facing at the moment. And so this morning, because of your role, your responsibilities, I'm not going to be a hypocrite with the elephant in the living room. I need to go straight to it. Gaza, Israel, Hamas, the war. How concerned is the fund?
What we see is more jitters in what has already been an anxious world. And on a horizon that had plenty of clouds, one more and it can get deeper. Why we are concerned? We are concerned first and foremost for the epicenter of this war, the tragic loss of lives, but also destruction and reduction of economic activity. Long-term consequences, kids not going to school today mean they won't have the skills for tomorrow. You expand the circle and you look at the neighboring countries, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan. There, the channels of impact are already visible. You have tourism-dependent countries. Uncertainty is a killer for tourist inflows. Investors are going to be shy to go to that place. Costs of insurance, if you want to move goods, they go up. Risks of even more refugees in countries that are already accepting more. And then you expand the circle to the world, Richard. What we see is an incredibly resilient world economy, but jittery and more so.
Like yourself, I never believe we count dollars or euros before we count loss of life. That always comes first, the loss of life. But you're going to have to deal with the aftermath. You're going to have to deal with countries that now they already have unsustainable debt burdens. Africa is already in trouble on debt. So how are you preparing the fund for what comes next?
Well, one of the big changes that are happening at the fund in a world of repetitive exogenous shocks. You know, we had COVID, and then the war, and then cost of living crisis, is to increase our financial strength. And I can tell you, even in a world of more geopolitical tensions, we are able to take decisions to make the fund a stronger pillar. We just were in Marrakesh, right. Richard. We got our members to say the fund needs 50% more of the financial strength it has today.
But when it comes to dispersing those funds, when it comes to the IMF programs, are you at risk of the old IMF problem? The restructuring program, the IMF program that requires austerity on countries that already have problems.
Richard, it is not your grandmother's IMF. I have said that many times, I will repeat it today. What the IMF stands for is first, precaution, prevention. It is cheaper than cure. We just revamped our precautionary capacity so we can help countries to avoid falling into a crisis. And second, when we support countries, our number one priority today is to say, we want you to be strong, grow for the future. So we have a very, very determined way of protecting social spending in our programs.
And if we look now at the areas of the world where obviously the Middle East, it's underway at the moment. You can't really know you're going to be required. You can prepare. But in Africa, following on from the rise in debt levels as a result of higher interest rates.
Yes. So you're putting your finger exactly on the right thing. What is happening in the Middle East is happening at the time when growth is slow, interest rates are high, cost of servicing debt that has gone up because of COVID and the war, these costs have gone up. What is our focus, Richard? On two things. For countries that are already overburdened, restructure the debt. And my call to countries that see debt becoming unsustainable is act early. Do not hesitate. We, the fund, we are here to help you restructure this debt. And two, well, make it possible for countries to have the financial capacity, the financial strength upfront. Like in Africa, you mentioned Africa. We have many governments where tax to GDP is below 10%. How can you have an economy functioning unless you collect more revenues? And actually, I look at the Minister of Finance of Saudi Arabia. This is what the country has done.
All right.
Build strength in good times.
The reality is higher for longer means more pain for longer.
Well, Richard, we have spent the last almost 20 years living, frankly, in terms of interest rates, in fantasy lane. How can you have interest rates at zero or even in negative territory and still create the savings and the capacity to function? It is actually going to normal to have interest rates that are in positive territory. The problem is it has happened too fast and the jump is too high.
But you wanted that.
We want to see normalization of monetary policy over time. We are not thrilled with going from 0 to 5 so quickly, but we are there. So now that we are there, our call to everybody is buckle up. Make sure that you understand interest rates are here to stay for longer. Remember, markets for quite some time pretended this is not going to happen, and then all of a sudden they woke up. Yeah, it is happening. So in this world of higher interest rates, of course, we would see these interest rates biting. We would see more businesses finding it difficult to survive. But, Richard, we are so exceptional as human beings in our creativity to cope with these shocks.
So where do you stand on this, we're going to get there, the last mile? Do we push inflation down to 2%, or do we fudge it and say, well, maybe by 26 if we get to 2%. Well, let's not worry too much about a number.
So, good news, bad news. Which one do you want first?
I'm going to get both anyway.
Okay, so let me give you the good news first.
Oh.
Good news is the tightening that we have witnessed over the last year plus is working. Inflation is going down. Bad news, not going down fast enough. So what we are, this is why I'm saying buckle up. What we are projecting is inflation to stay above 2% through 24, maybe even somewhat in 25. And then only then we would see interest rates moderating to where they should be, in positive territory, but not so high.
Right, but do you want to crush inflation in the short term, or are you prepared and think it's preferable to allow longer?
Look, we do need a conversation on what are the inflationary pressures. Are some of these pressures structural? For example, the green transition, it is adding for the next years to costs. and it is a must to do it. Or fragmentation. You know that we have assessed the cost of fragmentation to be just trade fragmentation, to be somewhere between 0.2 and 7% of global GDP. Obviously, these costs, they mean that costs of services and goods are pushed up. So how we think about inflation in a world where there are structural factors, look at the rich countries, demography is such that we have to factor it. How is this going to impact price dynamics? But that cannot be an excuse from abandoning the fight against inflation. Why? Because inflation is terrible for growth. It undermines investment confidence, it undermines consumer confidence. And who pays the highest price? Poor people.
But on that balance between crush it and fine, if we have to have a recession, we have to have a recession, or let's wait until maybe another year or two, or is it not as linear as that?
It is not that linear, because what we are seeing is remarkable adaptability in businesses to higher interest rates. We have done in the past something wonderful. We built a stronger financial system after the global financial crisis. Now we are reaping off the benefits because interest rates are not suffocating, they're just making life harder.
So I want to finish. You said multi-year exogenous events. And I guess if we were trying to be nice, we'd say each one, you have the event and it finishes, then you have the next one and it finishes, then you have the next one. But what we've learned, of course, is it doesn't work like that. So we have Ukraine, we have global slowdown, economic inflation. We have the war in the Middle East, which threatens to get much, much worse. Are we overloaded with multiple crises that the system and the decision makers can no longer cope?
This is what makes me lose sleep. We are in a world of more frequent and devastating exogenous shocks. They do not come by our wishes, they come very often unexpected. How we think of the unthinkable and how we create the agility to buffer our people and our businesses when the unthinkable happens. This is a job for everybody. For us at the IMF, it translates into thinking about multiple scenarios and then what is the right policy course when the unthinkable happens. And so
Can we cope? Can we cope?
Well, that's what I want to tell people here. Look at what we have done. COVID brought the world economy to a complete halt. And we lived through a fairly modest recession, minus 3% in 2020. 2021, very significant growth, 6%. Then we get hit by a war. Look at the economy today, we are still growing at 3%. The problem is that this is not going to be the last shock. We know it. I don't know where it would come from. I know it will come. We have climate threats. We have this interdependence of our economies. And we have what Ajay Banga spoke about, dangerous divergence. Some countries doing well, others falling further behind. What does that call for? It calls for solidarity. It calls for us overcoming our childish tendency to point fingers at each other in a world where we need to hold hands.
I think that's a perfect moment for me to say, Managing Director, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.